Today I want to answer a question that a survivor made after she made the choice to cut off contact with her abusive family and then experienced ridicule from her church community and asked how to deal with this situation. This is not a spiritual or religiously focused community, but patterns of abuse that exist in our family of origin can lead to susceptibility to abuse in other situations, including in church communities. Start with healing one trigger at a time. You can do this. Hi, I'm Tamara Ridge, licensed marriage and family therapist and survivor of complex PTSD. Part of my own healing process involved removing myself from a religious community that held similar patterns for me as those that existed in my childhood. I help survivors with tips and strategies for navigating the day-to-day problems that come from childhood trauma so that they can heal. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing so I can support you on your healing journey. I want to begin by saying that the decision to cut off contact from your family of origin is a very personal one, and it requires a lot of courage to recognize that you need to do this to facilitate your own healing process. Making that decision probably required you to finally put your own healing in front of your family's needs. And that's hard to do because it means you have to stop trying to please them and start setting boundaries so that you can establish safety in your life. Although this may seem selfish or unforgiving to people who don't really understand your full circumstance, remember, anyone who believes that you're being selfish or unforgiving either doesn't understand the dynamics of abusive families or has a similar dynamic in their own family that still needs healing. What I've found in situations like this is that there's a poor understanding of service, spirituality, and someone's relationship with God. So let's get into that just a little bit more. First of all, I really want you to understand that sacrificing your own well-being serves no one. If you're worn out and anxious and emotionally unwell because somebody continues to harm you, then staying in that state doesn't allow you to give from a full cup. Secondly, let's talk about forgiving and what it really means. Now, I had to look up this definition, and so what I found when I looked it up was, what is biblical forgiveness? Biblical forgiveness is the process of forgiving someone or being forgiven as illustrated in the Bible. Forgiveness itself is defined as letting go of sin. In the Bible, this includes forgiving everyone, every time, of everything as an act of obedience and gratefulness to God. Now, if you think about that, and you think about people being critical of you because you're not being a good example of forgiving when you've cut off your family, this is where you might feel condemned. But let's continue to look at this definition. It acknowledges that the sacrifice that God made through his son Jesus, who died to restore the relationship between God and man. So if Jesus died to restore that relationship, then that relationship between you and God is the most important one. I would submit to you that continuing to interact with people who continue to traumatize you actually takes away from your relationship with God. But let's look at the next piece. Forgiveness does not mean excusing, forgetting, permitting repetition of the sinful acts against you, or guaranteeing reconciliation with the perpetrator. That's really important to understand. You cannot heal when you're continuing to be harmed. And in a biblical sense, when you think about that, how are you supposed to set an example that God has healed you if you continue to submit to what that definition describes as a sinful act against you? So the other thing that I want you to think about when you're considering this definition and considering giving from a full cup is that your decision is between you and God, whatever that looks like for you. I make this point Because one of the fundamental dynamics that exists in ongoing abusive relationships is the perpetrator's focus on separating you from what you know is right for you. That's the only way someone can abuse you, is if they get between you and what you know is right for you. Think about this. Abusive parents require that a child that they're harming focus more on the parent's needs than on the child's needs. That's the nature of abuse. Later in adulthood, abusive partners and abusive associates, friends, coworkers do the same thing. They put their own needs first and insist that you don't pay attention to yours. This is true of unhealthy working environments as well. And as much as we hate to believe it, unhealthy church congregations and church leaders do it too. Because after all, there's abusive families in church communities, and people learn to separate from themselves and call it righteousness when that's not what that is. But in church, we have this added thing where instead of just getting between you and your feelings for yourself, they get between you and your relationship with God. In my understanding and in my healing, part of what I had to take back was anyone who would call themselves an intermediary between me and God. So, one thing that I do want you to think about, because sometimes people have trouble identifying, if I leave this situation that feels toxic to me because it's activated my fight-flight response, does that mean that I'm just in my trauma and I'm allowing my trauma to control me? Well, I'm going to answer that question. But first, I want to ask you a question. How have you dealt with this problem when it's shown up? When you've been trying to heal your own trauma? People trying to separate you from what you need. One of the things that I will tell you is that when you start standing up for yourself in this way, people are going to push back because they don't understand what healthy is. So, let's talk about your fight or flight response. The fight or flight response, remember, it's a knee-jerk emergency response that happens without your choice. That's the thing that we need to keep us safe. Like if a bear comes running in the room, we don't want to think about it and figure out if we're making a logical decision. We just want to get the heck out of there so we can survive. That's what the fight or flight response is for. When you make a decision to leave an unhealthy situation, that can be deliberate and well thought out, in spite of the fact that you also have your fight or flight response going on in the background. I'm going to talk more in a future video about making healthy choices that used to be compulsive reactions very soon. Until then, thank you for watching, and remember that you're precious. And it's good for you to take care of yourself. Give yourself permission to do that. And I'll see you next time.